Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for the Indigenous Governance Speaker Series. This is the second part to our speaker series, which we launched last semester with 4 speakers, and we have 4 new speakers that will be joining us over the next 4 months, starting today with Dr. John B Zoe. My name is Rhiannon Klein, and I'm the chair and an instructor in the Indigenous Governance degree program here at UQuan University. And I just want to acknowledge that we are gathering today on the traditional territories of the Kwanlundan First Nation and the Ta'an Quachin Council, but we also have people joining us all across the north and in southern Canada, so it's very exciting to see the diversity of people that have been able to join us today. And part of the amazing thing of being able to do these talks virtually. So as I mentioned, we do have 4 speakers coming up, starting with Dr. Zoe today, and then our next speaker will be Mitch White. And Mitch will be discussing capturing and sharing stories through traditional and social media and the power that stories really hold to document, preserve, strengthen, and share traditional values and contemporary truths. So we'll be sharing out more information about that next speaker series through all of our social media links through UQuan University, as well as through the speaker series website, where you can also find recordings of all of our past speakers. But without further ado, we're very excited to be joined today by Dr. John B Zoe. Just a brief introduction, Dr. Zoe was the Chief Land Claims Negotiator along with negotiations team, as well as an elder advisor for the former Treaty 11 Council of the Northwest Territories from 1994 until its conclusion with the establishment of the Tlicho Government in 2005. John is now a senior advisor to the Tlicho Government and a co-lead to the Indigenous Relationships to Land theme for the Modern Treaties Implementation Research Project. John was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Laws from the University of Alberta in recognition for all of his work in the development of the new government, as well as his contributions to projects that are built upon a foundation of Tlicho language, culture, and ways of life. He's also a recipient of the Order of the Northwest Territories and the Tlicho Government Recognition Award. So John, I will pass it over to you. I'll just remind everyone to please keep yourself muted. We will have time at the end for questions and discussion. Feel free to raise your hand or type questions into the chat box. And I just want to remind everyone today that we are recording today's speaker series. If you have any concerns about being recorded during the question period, please just send me a note and I'm happy to pause the recording while you ask your question. So over to you, John.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk a little bit about my experience, but it's also in my involvement from being at the table since 1989, a little bit over 30 years. But it's one of the about Indigenous governance, Indigenous land claims, Indigenous rights, all these things, and all the things that we hear today. How do we make sense of those things, and how do they all fit together? So I've been on this quest for a number of years, going back over 20 years, and trying to see the story and to tell the story in a way that is understandable. And one of the places that I found this story was with the elders, because in the early years when before we get into negotiations, we had to build a case to our elders to get into a claim and how that claim might look like and what are we trying to get at anyways. So I didn't come up with this picture, but this picture was something that they talked about a lot. And so I'll just get right into it if that's okay. That in our own story, our stories are written in the landscape, and anybody that studies Indigenous government history that history goes back to where it was written. And it was written literally into the landscape. And so one of the earliest stories that we have on that I'm aware of anyways is the story of the earliest place names that talk about giant animals, way on the left side here, where I'm coloring in yellow. And the second set of place names is the conflict between the animals and the people as to who would prevail. And so these are recorded in the place names of those conflict sites. And the third big story in the place names is the travels of Yamoza, which is where he visited the conflict sites and neutralized it, and generally said that it's the people that would be the predators. And the fourth one, the set, is how people took an inventory of the land, where the fish are, where the muskrats are, where the moose frequent, where the caribou migration is, and how to get there. And all these place names are recorded, is a recording of that history. And part of that recording is that the whole history of beginning of our own time, it records interaction with other Indigenous groups around us. And that's why overlaps are very important in discussions with land claims and governance. We need to build those relationships. And so that was the story that we've always lived before contact. And then something happened. Something happened eventually where we are right now in this area, where the first big drawdown happened to the early colonization, where our food sources were commercialized, like the caribou, the meats, the furs, and anything that's edible, the wood that we used, the canoes, everything that we had was used to supply the food products to the newcomers. And so that was a big drawdown. And the second big drawdown was the title of lands by the Royal Proclamation, where they said it's ours now, and if anybody wants land from the crown, then we have to go through them, and that's how the treaties began. But prior to 1763, there were alliance-type treaties that were being made when you're having this conflict over Canada. And the third big drawdown was when the British North America Act, where they transferred the powers to Canada. But prior to that, from 1763 to 1867, the Crown had did the unnumbered treaties. And so when they turned over the stuff to the Crown, and the Crown started doing, or Canada started doing treaties on behalf of the Crown up until 1921. And so those are the numbered treaties 1 to 11. And so in 1921, when we took our treaties, that was the big drawdown was over subsurface resources. Okay, and also right after treaties, so Canada inherited all these. Canada inherited a lot of these treaties where now Canada receives everything, and then they send it to their parliamentarians and their structures of government, and they distribute all those resources to the entities, which are like the crown entities, where they engage the licensed entities like businesses and businesses like churches and NGOs, and so the agencies do a distribution like grants and those kind of things. So universities are part of that, part of those entities. And so you get your funding from agencies, through research and education and all that kind of stuff. And you raise your own too, with partnerships with other entities on the same bar level. And so part of what Canada has done was in 1876, where they did legislation called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act created an Indian agent that now had access to the people in the Indian Act. And so that's where the decision making, like the Band Council resolutions, come in, and that's a form of communication with the Indians. And then you send your BCR back signed, and they look at it and they say, okay, well, maybe give them a little bit more, or not at all. But because they had the authority through the Indian Act, they make arrangements with the churches for education. And that's the legacy of the residential schools. And eventually, the Indian Act was amended in 1953 or something, around that area, where the legislation said that the entity or the departments now have Child and Family Services now has access to the Indians. Okay, and some of these over time has been transferred to the provinces, or else here in the north it would be Government of Northwest Territories, and so their departments also have access to those things. And when they go into the Indian Act, and same as it is today, where you have services that don't exist. But if you're talking about the 1800s, people are still living in tents, they're still wandering around in the bush, and so all of a sudden Canada has brought over its standards from overseas, very different than what people are used to. And when those case workers go into the Indian Act box, their standards are 150 years higher than ours. So the first thing they do is they scoop up these kids, and that's what they call the 60s scoop. And so we have all this stuff that's going on. And so what do we do in the meantime is that we know that in our time, a lot of the drawdowns that are happening that we were at full strength over here. And so with all these drawdowns that are happening, our strength started to go down. We started losing our languages. We started losing, access to our food sources, and everything. We were gutted out. How's that? We were gutted out. And so with that gutting out that was happening, with happening, that you can see if you follow the red lines where all these things were drawn down and transferred to Canada. They transfer some to the provinces, GNWT. They give it to their entities and their agencies, and they also legislate their own departments to go in and pillage the people even more of identity, of language, of being displaced, being removed, being renamed, and everything. So with that kind of things that are going on, we don't have. We're in this area. We're in that area right here. It's where we are, and so the Crown would only look at the Indian Act leadership that they had set up, and it would ignore this part of where people have always been. And because they never recognized the people from where they were, but they would recognize them from where they would put. And so there's two big things that are going on, is that none of those resources that are drawn down make their way into this Indian box that we had. So because the systems that were put into place from overseas and adopted over here does not take into consideration the people that were there before, okay? And so you have these treaties that were made over here over time, that those things were never fulfilled. And so this is about fulfilling the terms of those treaties. And sometimes those treaties were pre-written. And so one of the ways of keeping these things alive is that if you look at some of these historical things and even verbal history that people talk about, is that what they saw at the time of treaty is that they said that we've never given up the land, and we need our language because that's what sustained us so far. And we also need to that our whole basis of who we are is around our language, culture, and way of life. And so those are over thousands of years, we've managed to carve out our own lifestyles in the areas that we're in, where we're in tune with the environment and we can survive. But we've been gutted out, and we don't have access to the resources, and it's systemic, so it doesn't fit us. And so the only way that these things happen is to relook at the treaties and say what's right and what's not. And so what was said by our leadership at the time of treaties is what you need to bring back. And what was said in our area, if you look at Google, as long as the sun rises, Google it and see how many times those things were mentioned in those treaties. As long as the sun rises and the rivers flow, and this thing doesn't take over, that we would not be restricted from our way of life, of moving forward in the same way that we were before colonization. We need to move forward, but at the same time, through these negotiations, what we're trying to do, or we have done anyways, is that we're the Canada and the entities and everybody recognizes us as being here. We know we're here because we're being managed there, okay, and we're not being looked at as if we're here. So what we're doing is that we're negotiating from this part, but the resources are all over here. And so when we negotiate, we say, okay, this box, it's a cruel it's a cruel form of recognition, okay? It's a cruel and crude form of recognition. But Canada seems to be putting things in there that they're used to feeding it. So that's something that we can't really let go right now. Well, we can let it go after you do your agreement, because if you remember about 15 years ago, Canada was saying that let's get rid of the Indian box, and people were saying, well, how can you? Well, what would we have left if you remove that? It's something that we know that is part of that system, but it's not recognized, but it's something that they make a contribution to. So what we're talking about is starting from where we are, where we're recognized by Canada, because that's their form of recognition for implementation of agreements. So we take this and we negotiate the ability to have a say with the entities and the way financing is done, the way business is done, and with agreement with Canada and with the agreement of the Northwest Territories, that we take an inventory of all the things that Canadians are eligible for, health, education, social services, land, language, culture, way of life that everybody enjoys, but we weren't. So this is an agreement is really an inventory of all the things that we should have been eligible for. And we talk about how those things will be done, but the agreement is about taking all that inventory and delivering it to your agreement. And in this case, let's say the Tlicho Agreement, which is based on the all the treaties, the recognition of the treaties, and the modern treaty that we're involved in is based on the 1982 Constitution. It's a recognition that all the treaties are still alive, and we come up with an agreement with Canada and government of Northwest Territories as to what that agreement is going to look like. And so part of that leadership is that that we would have a Grand Chief that's selected from the people through our own constitution to take a seat here. And then you would have chiefs that are selected by the Indigenous community, okay, just by the Indigenous community, to become the executive, like a cabinet. And the assembly is a combination of community governments that are municipalities where Indigenous members are chosen after the election to take their seats here. But because they're coming from the systemic side, they need to be sworn in based on your own constitution that you have developed outside of the agreement, but that governs yourself. And so the constitution is not something that we negotiate with Canada or GNWT. It's something that we develop ourselves to ensure that that our government is representing, have the ability to make those transactions and work on the implementation to ensure that all these things are being transferred by legal agreements, the Western style, and you provide them with reports. That's just the money part. But what do you do for yourself as your own government is that you try to start reinvesting into yourself, because over here, your internet was at full strength, and after colonization, our internet has gone way down here. And so we need to reinvest into the activities of land, language, culture, and way of life to re-strengthening exercise to bring it back to its full force. And so, and that business on this side is ours. It's got nothing to do with Canada. It's got nothing to do with GNWT. These are what we call our rights to our land, to our language, culture, and way of life. But we need to rebuild and re-strengthen that activity by doing land programs, language revitalization, the practice of culture, practices of our ways of life, which is studying your own land, where all your history is written, and where your language derives from that landscape, and the way that you use the land for harvesting, and the names of all the animals, and how to use those things, and your way of life. And so that's what we're talking about, is that we're talking about our knowledge, the knowledge transfers that our youth, our future generation, have a right to that through our own arrangements, is that we need to make those things available. It's not something that government's going to give back to you, because what they took away from you is not those things, but what they took away from you was the resources from the lands. And it's those resources that kept us strong before, but it's those resources that were devoid from our lives for the last 150 years. And so now that we have an arrangement to bring it back, the real education happens here, not to ourselves, but also the agreements that we make with Canada. And when we talk about Canada, we're talking about a table that is set up in Ottawa where you're sitting around in a group. But that agreement, once it's signed, how do you do implementation on that side? Well, it takes education. It takes new legislation, new policies, new research, all these kind of things that need to be triggered, as well as with the territorial government, because Canada has transferred a lot to the territories and the provinces, especially in health, education, and social services, and even municipalities. They were financing their municipalities through the provinces as well as the delivery of services, but they never catered to the Indigenous groups. So that's why you hear about these boil water advisories, because those municipal type things has never been worked out to a degree where it's a fullness. It's always an empty box or half empty box, and it's always managed by somebody else. So those things are important. And a lot of things that we need from the younger generation is the development of skills from the Western side, okay, to understand that system. Because when you're doing implementation to an agreement that's already there, that we need to understand how these systems on the Western Front works, so that so even the way that the agencies look upon funding organizations, NGOs, and tax and all these kind of things that they do unto themselves, well, we got to tell them somehow that, oh, we have this agreement where, oh, you're going to have to share with us now, okay? And so those kind of things need to happen. And a lot of these policy things that drives big governments are usually done through research. Like let's say, Canada agencies, one of them would be SSHRC. You know, I'm sure the Yukon University hears about SSHRC all the time. Social sciences research group, and then they would match up with a university, and they do research into all kinds of things. And past research has always been about how to strengthen the Western Front to make more better, efficient use of the resources that they get to enhance their systems. But all they're doing is refine-tuning the drawdowns to make it more efficient for themselves. But it's making the Indigenous people even further deeper into the hole that was dug. And so, one of the things that we're doing a lot now is with the Land Claim Agreement Coalition in Canada, where there's about 20 some odd numbers of groups that got together to talk about policy development. How do we engage in policy development? Well, we engage the universities. We also engage the agencies in partnership with an entity like universities to study and do research into governance, okay, or implementation, so that those papers that research that are being done, you know, we have to keep promoting it up the chain. And if you have enough support, and it's going to take many attempts, that some of them might eventually make their way into policies. And it's the policies that drive governments on both sides. And so those knowledge that we have over here and the skills that are over there, how do we acquire those skills without losing ourselves? Okay. How do we stand up to a system that is designed to tear us down? And if you send your young people to these universities, what kind of strength are they bringing with them? Are they taking their land in their system? Do they have the language in their system? Do they have the culture in their system, a way of life? So that means we need to rebuild, not rebuild, but to strengthen all those bars that have been on the decline for many, many years. And so with that strength that you have, you can bring that knowledge with you to to an area where you can operate all the way even to the river on the other side, to acquire those skills over here, so that when you're operating in this area, you're operating with the strength of two, strong like two people, two-eyed seeing, that you're going there and you're going to get those skills without losing your identity, without losing your focus. And you're going there with your strength that's going to hold you up. And so you acquire those skills, and and eventually you might be part of that group that works on implementation. And part of the implementation is that, because the implementation is something that has now got to take into consideration the people that are now going into this area, operating like strong like two people, that they're operating like strong like two people, that whatever we accomplish in the migration of the resources up to here, that it's very different than the type of evaluation that happens on this side. Has always been, how does it fulfill the requirements of governments when those transfers are being done, that it's measured by the Western evaluation. And so we need to look at our own systems of evaluation when anything is introduced back into ours area, that our evaluation is to ensure that we are doing a strengthening exercise and not a continual drawdown exercise that we're so used to. Okay, so there's a lot of things to think about. And one of the tools that is available nowadays is over here, when I was talking about the residential schools, where the churches were delegated to do this on behalf of the Crown, that we know that people in the systems, we know what the outcomes are. We see them all the time. We see the breakdown of the people. We see things that continues to happen, like the 60 scoop. They don't call it that anymore, but systemically, it's still operating. And they will continue until somebody changes policies or changes direction. And who's gonna? And the system it only evaluates for itself and not for other people. So we need to have an input into that. And so TRC calls to action is a good way of introducing it, because it was commissioned by Canada, and whatever it commissions, it's got to listen to, it's got to follow up on it, but the follow-up has to happen by us, driven by us, and so that it doesn't get watered down. And so that's why we need to do research and make alliances and even educate ourselves a little bit better to know more about it in a shorter time frame, and it should happen earlier. It should happen, with the activities on land, language, culture, and way of life, all the way down to preschool. We got to start from there. And the other tool that has popped up in the last year, Canada rejected it back in 2007, but it's now adopted UNDRIP, and the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People is a declaration that Canada has adopted. But now the onus is on us to kind of define what UNDRIP is. Okay, that UNDRIP is like a net that's cast over these countries, and then we see all the gaping holes of where that fishnet has the gaping holes, and the gaping holes are mostly on our side where the sun is. Okay, where the sun is. And so when the gaping hole is there, we need to kind of fill in by our own intellect how those gaping holes can be filled up in partnership, which is really an implementation of your own treaties that you have negotiated. And so these are, comes back to what I was talking about earlier, was at the time of treaty, we know where Canada was coming from because, we can see what they've been up to. They've drawn down everything. And at the time of treaty, there was two parties. One had a pre-written treaty, and one had a verbal, where our chiefs here, anyways, said that I'll accept treaty on the basis that as long as the sun rises and the rivers flow. Okay. And if this thing doesn't take over, that we would not be restricted from our way of life, because now we have our own door as to what comes through onto this side, where we are doing and a strengthening exercise. And so that the future generation, as long as the sun rises, river flows, land does not move, that we would not be restricted from our way of life, which is the future generations who are going to carry on this work of ensuring that recognition and implementation and evaluation using our own systems is put into place, so that we have something to build upon, which is our own foundation. Thank you. I'll take any questions if you want.
Thank you so much, John. I always love watching you present and speak. Because we only have about 10 minutes, I'll open it up for others to ask any questions or comments or points of discussion you'd like to raise with John while we have him here. Feel free to put up your hand or unmute yourself, or type anything into the chat.
There.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Hi. I was curious to know, you talked a little bit of, I see UNDRIP. How is that working in the Northwest Territories implementing UNDRIP?
Well, in the north, I think Gina Beauty is now considering how it's going to put it into the systems. So they've been having hearings. It's uh, it's in the House, and they're receiving comments now. And I'm not sure when it'll be tabled, but Canada has approved it. BC has approved it, um, and so they're still considering it. I presented to them earlier to the hearings, and that's where it's at right now.
Thank you.
Thanks. There's just some comments in the chat there for you, John, but there was one question. Someone says, as an educator, how do I ensure that I'm supporting the next generation within a system that has been framed from a colonial system? Do you have any suggestions in that regard?
Yeah, well, there are. Oh, did I lose my picture? Must be somewhere in the back there.
We still see it here.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm not sure if I got rid of it. Oh, this is not it. Oh, let's see. Here it is. I think that chat threw me off.
Oh, sorry. I can read out the questions to you, but this question was mostly around how do we support the next generation within a sort of education system and broader system that is really framed from a colonial system?
Yeah, well, one of the things about the North is that, like in the Northwest Territories, the population is about 50% Indigenous. Yukon might be different, Nunavut might be different, but there's a lot more clout. There's a lot more Indigenous legislators that are out there. And a lot of these curriculum developments that are happening all the time, we have to be part of it, that development. And so every time there's curriculum development in the North, I try to be part of it. And so that's, so right now, it's finding ways of doing it. And the onus is really, if you're already in the system, like you're doing right now in the learning institution, that you start to see all these things and try to come up with some ideas on how to make it better, which means dialoguing with curriculum developers and introducing land activity, introducing language, cultural presence, and the way of life that every community has is, bring that with you into the schools. That you don't need to go in with your, with your white shirts and shorts like they did in residential schools. To do that, you can wear your own stuff. You can make presents. You can speak your language. You can do research into your own world views rather than some economic thing on the south part. You can do both, because we're talking about having two lenses in everything that we do. Is that if you're going to do something for the Western side, do an equal value on your side. If you're talking to professors, well, you should be talking to elders at the same time. And if you're doing land acknowledgement in your institutions, well, go visit the land. And if you're going to do cultural practices in a school, well, go see a real one, you know. And for your way of life, you know, we can say, well, we used to do this. Well, go and do it, you know. Go make dry fish, or learn how to skin a muskrat and eat it, you know, because that's life. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it, because on the Western Front, you know, we like to travel to Europe and other countries. Well, you don't have to give that up. And we also learn how to speak French. We learn to speak English. You know, there's nothing wrong with learning your own language. And for cultural activities, you know, we go to these movie theaters and entertainment that is constantly on in any major city. While there are annual gatherings of almost every Indigenous group across Canada who have annual gatherings, and they celebrate their culture. And then you have these canoe trips, like they have them in BC, they have them all over the place. Join one of those things and find out what kind of way of life that used to exist at the time. The knowledge that only we have, but has been used to gut us out, that we can take that same way of making sure we strengthen some of the losses using the resources that were taken away from us, and we've gotten it back. Sometimes you can do it through agreements, or you can just do it by practicing on an individual basis. Masi.
Thank you, John. There are a few questions in the chat. We just have a few minutes left, so maybe I'll just put one more out to you. This is from Marianne Villeneuve. She says, "Merci, John, for your knowledge and for sharing with us. My question is, since having your self-government, has anything changed in negotiations with GNWT in Canada, or do you feel it is still an ongoing struggle?"
No, it's the thing to watch out for is that I was talking about policies earlier, that any government that's not Indigenous has policies that drive government. And every so often, they're obligated to review some of these policies to upgrade them, or some new direction from the courts, make them revisit their policies. And when those things happen, that's the time to jump in, to have a say on what that policy is going to look like going into the future, and not something that's going to be dragged into the future. Okay, so we need to be cognizant of that and be aware that that's where the changes really happen. It doesn't happen on the street. It happens when government takes the initiative to open it up and call for input, like the UNDRIP thing I was talking about. It's in the House in Yellowknife, and you know they're having speakers there, but don't see any Indigenous people there. You know, there's lawyers and there are consultants and all that kind of stuff, but you don't see very many people there. You know, we need to shift our way of thinking, that we can't wait for invitations. We have to invite ourselves, the same way that the colonial systems have invited themselves and took over. We need to invite ourselves to reclaim some of the things that we need to carry on. Masi.
Thank you so much, John. And apologies to those we didn't get to all of the questions, but they are in the chat there, John, if you would like.
Okay.
And I just included the website there for our Indigenous Governance Speaker Series. For those of you who joined a little bit late, we were recording today's session, so you will be able to watch the full presentation once we have it posted. And you'll also see information on our upcoming speakers, Mitch White, Jocelyn Joe Strack, and Erin Matariki-Carr, who we're really looking forward to having join us over the next 3 months. But Masi Cho, John, it's been such a pleasure having you present and join us over the lunch hour today. And thank you to everyone who joined us. It was a great turnout.
Thank you, Masi.
Take care, John.
Bye.